flawed.
Let's bring in Congressman Steny Hoyer of Maryland. He is the House Minority Whip and a member of the Democratic Steering Committee. And Congressman, thank you for being here today.
Good to be with you.
All right, so let's say where you think we stand on health care, where you think we could actually get if the two sides were to work together. And let me throw that out saying be as realistic as possible. What's a plan that you think both sides could actually try and work together on?
Well, I think it's difficult to know that because I'm not sure exactly what the Republicans are willing to do. But Senator McConnell made it clear that if, in fact, they failed to pass a replacement bill, that he thought the alternative was to work together with Democrats. I think that's the right way to go. I don't think it was a bad alternative. I think it's the preferable alternative. I think we need to deal with the small markets. We need to deal with cost. We need to make sure that counties everywhere throughout America have access to an insurance policy. So I think all of those things ought to be on the table. I think we ought to make sure that we can stabilize the market, the reinsurance provisions that we undercut because the Republicans wouldn't approach the money that was set forth in the bill to do and undermined and increase prices and undermine the market stability. I think we could accomplish all of those things if we work together, and that's what we ought to do. And we'll see whether or not the Republicans will either next week or sometime in the future repeal. I think the CBO is right on target with what the ramifications of that would be. And when I talk to my small hospitals or I talk to other providers or I talk to docs, and frankly, you talk to insurance companies, if they repeal, the market will be substantially disrupted and millions of people, far more than repeal and replace, would be adversely affected.
Congressman, we were speaking with Peter Orszag an hour ago, and he pointed out some statistical analysis of all these things. We talk about them broadly, but he pointed out that there are 40 out of 3,000 counties right now that have 0 providers for the exchanges. There are 1,000 out of the 3,000 that have only 1, and obviously that needs to be addressed. But he also said that when you really start talking about the exchanges, only 4% of the exchanges are for people who are under the age of 65. So mostly it's a senior citizen plan that you have there. And really, he said the huge issue is the Medicaid expansion. That is the issue that needs to be tackled in one form or another, that needs to be discussed, that needs to be come around to. Is there any sort of middle ground that you can find when it comes to just the Medicaid expansion? Because that has the potential to really be a massive bill. But at the same time, if you don't have that, you are not going to have nearly as many Americans covered.
I think that's absolutely correct. And of course, CBO said if you eliminate the Medicaid expansion, 15 million people lose their insurance in 2018 alone, and more going forward. So clearly you've got to deal with that, and that's, for instance, what Republican governors, Sandoval in Nevada, Kasich in Ohio, other Republican governors have expressed such deep concern about, that they've got to find a way to deal with those people and make sure that they have access to health care insurance. What we ought to do responsibly is sit down at the table. You and I both know that there were no hearings, no witnesses, no amendments to any of these bills, and there has not even been a chance for Republicans in a committee setting to have hearings or offer amendments. So if we start to do that, I think good ideas will percolate up. We'll see whether or not there is common ground, and if there is common ground, and hopefully there would be, then we can move forward. And that's what we ought to do. That's the legislative process, and I think that's what Americans expect us to do.
Congressman Hoyer, this is Arthur Brooks from AEI.
Hi, how are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
You and I are both residents of the great state of Maryland, and we have a big problem in Maryland, so I want to take in just a slightly different health care direction. You know that we have a very good governor in Larry Hogan, a Republican who's been able to work across party lines very successfully. And one of the things that's most keeping him up at night is the fact that Maryland has the highest percentage of people dying of opiate overdoses of any state in the country per capita. But this is a nationwide problem. 60,000 Americans are going to die of drug overdoses this year. It's a real epidemic. And so I would love to hear what's on your mind in the Congress, and just you personally, what you think some of the things that we could do to try to get our minds around this problem and start passing legislation that's going to save some lives.
Well, of course, as you know, we passed some opioid legislation, and we put some funds toward it in the last Congress. Governor Hogan and all Maryland policymakers and all Marylanders are concerned about the opioid crisis, which is very, very substantial, as you point out, in our state. That's one of the reasons Governor Hogan, as you know, has opposed the repeal of the Affordable Care Act in the forms that the Republicans have so far put on the table, because he believes it would substantially undermine Maryland's ability to respond to the crisis. But we need legislation going forward. We need to have a bipartisan agreement on how we work with the medical community on the overprescription of opioids, access to opioids, and education for the public. But clearly it is an epidemic in every part of the country. So it's not just Maryland. And you talk to anybody I talk to of my colleagues, wherever state they come from, they are very worried about the opioid epidemic that is occurring and the deaths that are occurring at such high levels. So again, this is an issue that cries out for bipartisan response.
Congressman Hoyer, Majority Leader McCarthy just said last night that the House is going to go ahead with the budget, but look at just 4 areas of the budget because they couldn't get enough support within the GOP for all 12 areas.
I think he's talking about the appropriations as opposed to the budget.
You're right, the appropriations area of this. What do you think about this progression, doing things piecemeal like this?
I think it's unfortunate. I think that the budget that is being proposed is unfortunate, but the appropriations process, they've had months to mark up bills. They've spent the last 3 days working well past midnight to pass their bills in a real hurry, and they're probably going to finish, I think, all 12 of the appropriation bills, but they're only going to push forward with 4. And the reason they're only going to push forward with 4, they don't have the votes to do the omnibus that they were talking about with all 12 appropriation bills. Matter of fact, nor should they move forward. We ought to consider these bills individually so members have the opportunity to review them, digest them, and make some rational decisions on them. I frankly think that the numbers that are in these bills are unrealistic, but what is really unrealistic is there is no budget yet which says what our discretionary number is going to be, how much we can spend discretionary dollars, so that when you vote for 4 bills, and they are substantially over those dollars, it means the remaining 8 bills will be cut very, very substantially. In fact, it's a plan for disinvestment in the domestic side of our budget. We think that's bad policy and bad for our national security. You need to deal both with our defense capabilities, our homeland protection capabilities, but you also need to deal with education, with health care, transportation, infrastructure investment, and the other priorities of our society.
Hey, Leader Hoyer, people keep asking, it's kind of the latest gotcha question. They ask any Democrat they can who the leader of the party is. And no one ever says anyone.
I gotcha. I've been asking for the past 3 days.
That's what I said.
Well,
it's a gotcha question, but
I don't think it's a gotcha question.
It's a gotcha question. Andrew even Andrew asked it. So I call you Leader Hoyer. Why don't just raise your hand? Say, I am the leader. I'm in charge, like Haig. Remember him? Yeah. You're in charge. You're the leader,
Joe. You just keep calling me leader, and I'll keep responding. Thank you very much.
It's fine. So now we have an answer. Standing Hoyer.
There you go.
Standing Hoyer. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Leader. Still ahead, we just wrapped up our conversation with House Minority